Hello everybody, we are the Global Leaders Alliance Fellows here at the School of Liberal Arts, Alliance University. We are very grateful to be sitting alongside somebody who is a pioneer in his field. He is one of the world's leading experts on energy, environment and natural resources. A common law qualified lawyer from Kenya, he is currently an Oxford Martin Fellow at the University of Oxford. We are one of the very fortunate students to be getting taught by him and to have gotten an opportunity to sit alongside him today. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Ted Moya Mose. Dr. Ted, thank you so very much for joining us today.
An absolute pleasure for me to be here. When you read that introduction, I was looking for who this auspicious person is because it just seems bigger than life. So thank you for that.
Thank you. So, for the larger interests of our audience, my very first question to you would be around your work. If you could maybe walk us through your academic and professional trajectories. How did you end up from being a lawyer to an academic, making that move from Kenya to Oxford? I think that'd be great for our audience.
Well, my journey is a rather interesting one. So my background is law and law. I have an undergrad in law, a master's in law, and a PhD in law. And I practiced for a significant number of years, being a partner in one of the mid-sized to top law firms in Kenya. And one of the things I was working on was commercial law and energy. And I was advising either multinationals or governments or essentially big ticket transactions. And I was also doing litigation work or disputes work. But on a personal level, my mom comes from an indigenous community, and there was the expansion of the electricity power lines, and these were passing through people's land. And some of the communities came to me to ask me for advice, but I could not for a variety of reasons. The first one was I was either conflicted because I was acting for the other party, but secondly, they came with these overly complex agreements, and many of them were either literate or semi-literate. And I looked at these agreements and I wondered, goodness, who's drafted these things? And to my shock, and not so much my horror, I discovered that for big ticket work in Africa, 19 of the top 20 firms doing that work were based in London. And at the time I needed a break, so I thought one of the best ways of taking a sabbatical is going to London and getting, sort of apprised on international energy law and policy. And so I did a master's in international energy law and policy and natural resources as well. And the plan was to go back to Kenya after about 9 months to a year. But then I was offered a scholarship to do a PhD on globalizing international energy law principles. And because it was some pioneering work and I was the inaugural recipient of this award, I decided that on balance, I should do it. And so what I thought would be a 9-month journey is 9 months going to 9 years now.
Dr. Ted, my question is about just energy transition. That we are talking about just energy transition in a scenario of global warming, as we are all aware. What you would like to tell the global leaders to reduce the consequences of global warming with regarding just energy transition and climate action policies?
This is a brilliant question. So the just energy transition has various elements to it. The entire idea of a transition is to almost have a metamorphosis of how energy systems currently work on a global scale. Of course, climate change and environmental issues are at the heart of it, because energy systems cause 66% or 2/3 of carbon emissions globally. So if we rein in on the energy industry, or if the energy industry is decarbonized or becomes less climate unfriendly, then we will of course go a long way in dealing with the climate change problem. But more than that, the just energy transition isn't just about ecological damage or environmental change. It's also about leaving no one behind. And that's why the word just is in there. It's about justice. It is about having fairer energy systems. It has economic aspects to it. Energy has to be affordable. Energy has to be accessible and has to be clean, not just in developed parts of the world, but in developing parts of the world. And we know there are great disparities in global energy consumption and provision. So, in a nutshell, the just transition is about transforming energy systems and decarbonizing them and making them fairer. So it has environmental aspects, it has political aspects, it has economic aspects, and it has elements of justice in it. Basically, we need to not only center people and the planet in this conversation.
Okay, so now I want to move on to understanding some very basic concepts that we use on almost a daily basis. And I think we may not necessarily understand the complexity of these terms. Climate change and energy crisis. So if you could just maybe let us know how these terms have been in use, but do we really understand the complexity and the gravity behind these terms?
Climate change is one of the most topical things to talk about, but probably one of the most understood. And to some extent, some people claim controversial, but that probably stems from the lack of understanding. So weather patterns are what you see on a day-to-day basis. So a lot of rain, brilliant sunshine, flooding. But when you talk about climatic conditions, these are conditions taken over the long term, usually roughly about 40 years. And if you look at the scientific data, over the last few centuries, especially after the turn of the 20th century, 19th, 20th, and now the 21st century, we are seeing an increase in global warming. And this is because of human activity and how we are harnessing resources and using them. Specific to energy, energy extraction, production, distribution, and use is depleting the environment, not only the resources themselves, but also it generates not only smoke and emissions that cause the earth to warm up. This then leads to different climatic conditions. Now, these climatic conditions are seen in everyday weather phenomena. Like for the past 4 years, each year has recorded the hottest day in history. And similarly, we are beginning to see harsher winters. We are seeing flooding in many parts of the world. We are seeing species literally being wiped out. We are seeing coral reefs now not only being bleached, but losing, and the ecosystem changing. So climate change is basically about human activity, what we call anthropogenic climate change. Human activity causing global warming, which changes the climatic conditions, which has an adverse effect on the environment or on ecology. So that is climate change, and that's a rather long-winded answer. But then the next question was on energy, or was it the energy transition?
Energy crisis.
The energy crisis. The energy crisis simply reflects the inability of people to access affordable, clean energy. And so the first one is access. We know from global statistics, and they keep changing because also the global population keeps increasing. But between 2015 and now, the number of people without access to electricity on a global scale hovers between 800 million and 1.2 billion. So that means that what we call modern life, many people do not enjoy it. But it's not just a question of a lack of enjoyment. It's about what alternatives are they using to access energy. So many of them use smoky biomass. Basically, they burn things for lighting, heating, cooking. And this has what we call morbidity and mortality impacts. It causes disease and it causes death. And these deaths are recorded in the millions every year. And if you look at WHO statistics, it's not getting any better, and it's distributed around the world. But now the energy crisis sometimes specifically refers to the unaffordability. So there are economic aspects here of energy that's even available to populations around the world. In the 70s, the energy crisis referred to the oil crisis, which led to actually the forming of OPEC, which was seen as a catalyst control over oil and how the world accesses it and for how much. Right now, we are talking about the energy crisis with almost everybody around the world and experiencing extremely high bills for not just electricity, but for transport in terms of oil and for other forms of energy. And so the crisis now is understood to mean the unaffordability of energy that exists, but it goes deeper than that. That for some people, that energy simply doesn't exist, and they burn wood and cow dung and anything they can find to stay warm and cook.
So you're saying that maybe after like 50 or maybe 100 years, the definition of energy crisis may evolve even further?
The definition may evolve even further, but I think the issues will largely be the same.
Yeah.
What humans need is clean, accessible, and affordable energy. And if they do not have that, I see it as a crisis, because that is the goal that we're aiming for.
So I was just going through some of your blogs that you published. So here I quote you, that you said even the best written laws need people who understand them to apply them. But the community needs to be aware that these laws exist. So based on this, what do you think are the reasons for the aperture in enforcing the laws and creating awareness about the same among the community?
Law enforcement becomes difficult for a variety of reasons. Understanding the laws is the one thing. I mentioned the communities that had these complex power purchase agreements that they did not understand. But there is more to that. The global energy law is fragmented. We do not have a standard energy law. We don't have a global parliament, a global judiciary, and a global executive, which means that many countries have their own versions of energy laws. But what my research entails and what I advocate for is slicing through the faff, slicing through the noise, and seeing what are the common and fundamental principles that we have, and then enforcing those around the world, and not just at state level or at country level, but at local level. And so for me, energy law is fundamental, and its evolution is fundamental to your question, because it's not just a matter of understanding, it's a matter of harmonizing the common principles we have, but then these common principles should follow what the common problems are to then define what the common solutions will be. And as we know, it's a fundamental principle acceptable almost around the world, that ignorance of the law is not a defense that's for criminal law. However, what we need for not just criminal law but other forms of laws is communicating them in a manner that is explicable and capable to be understood, not just by the most sophisticated minds, but by everybody who's affected by them. And so this is one of the reasons we're sitting here, because education and dissemination and advocacy are key in translating these complex laws into everyday concepts that people understand.
So my next question is on Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular the SDG 7, which is access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. Now, these are some very heavy terms, and I think we'd be grateful if you could just maybe break these down for us to just understand what these terms really mean.
This is an interesting one, because Sustainable Development Goals, especially Sustainable Development Goal 7, they're broad, they're aspirational, they're targets. And so some of these terms are expressed in extremely broad terms. So Sustainable Development Goals, for those who do not know, is about accessible, affordable, and clean energy for all. Now, Sustainable Development Goals are not standalone goals. There are about 20 goals which are sort of intertwined. But when we look at Sustainable Development Goal 7 itself, if we're talking about accessible energy, it means that people can actually get this energy. So there's a concept called energy poverty, which I've explained just a few moments ago, that about 1.2 billion people in the world don't have access to energy or modern energy services. So when we talk about modern energy services, we're talking about electricity, we're talking about electricity that is of a capacity that allows them to not just have heating and cooling and cooking, but to be able to do their economic activities. And the International Energy Agency has actually given some form of definition of what access to energy looks like. And it looks at domestic, it looks at the capacity to do some form of commercial activity using modern and clean energy services. When we talk about clean energy, there can be a misconstruction in various parts of the world. In part of my research, I had a group from South Africa who did not have access to energy. And when the concept of clean energy was presented to them, they thought it entails just shifting to electricity. Whether that electricity comes from coal or whichever source was not important to them. It was something that does not smoke in the house. But that is not what's meant in Sustainable Development Goal 7. It means energy that is produced and consumed in ways that are not harmful to the environment. And this means moving away from fossil fuels and using renewable energy. So that is Goal 7. Some people actually refer to Sustainable Goal 7 as acceleration of renewable energy. And then affordability is relative, because we know on a global scale people have different purchasing power. So whatever the context, energy prices should not cripple the people who get access to those services. The EU has certain standards and questions about affordability, and one of them is, do you use more than 30% for your energy needs? And 30% sometimes does not just refer to the electricity in the house, it includes transport. And many people, as we know, especially in cities around the world, use more than that. So affordability goes beyond developing and developed countries. It's a global problem, because at the moment energy prices are simply beyond the reach of most people on the planet. So that's in essence what Sustainable Development Goal 7 is about. And I argue that Sustainable Development Goal 7 needs more interrogation, because it's not just about getting electricity that can light your home, but electricity that can actually enable you to thrive wherever you are in the world. At the moment, we know that a lot of distributed energy services or energy access initiatives simply allow people to have a bulb in the house or to be able to charge their mobile phone, but they cannot do much more. And I think we really need to up the standard to ensure that people enjoy at least an irreducible minimum quality of energy access.
We have already talked about energy transition, climate action and all. So what are the unique issues that the developing countries face in the climate crisis and energy transition?
Developing countries face various challenges when it comes to the climate crisis. I'll use the example of Africa and then expand it to other developing countries beyond Africa. Africa contributes 3% of carbon emissions, yet Africa has some of the most vulnerable people to the impact of climate change. This then becomes slightly more complicated because the resources, the energy resources that are polluting to the environment are vastly available in Africa when we talk about coal, oil and gas. And if we take a step back and look at the development of energy, we had the discovery of fire, then we had the agrarian revolution, and then we had the industrial revolution that was fueled by coal and then later oil and gas, which are polluting fuels. So developed countries reached their stage of development by doing two things: by using depletable resources, which are fossil fuels, which then have caused the climate change problem. But it gets, and some people think this is far more insidious, they use these resources from developing countries. And so developing countries argue, if you used your fossil fuels to develop, why should we be stopped now from using the same fossil fuels to get to a stage of development and then we can decarbonize? So these are some of the unique challenges that the people most impacted by climate change are the least responsible. But then there's a question of developing countries are classified as developing countries because they lack the financial might of developed countries. And so even with well-intentioned policies, there's a huge financing gap in transitioning from fossil fuels, because there are two elements to transitioning. One, there's the fact that new infrastructure is needed for cleaner sources of energy, but two, it means that there's a loss of income from the loss of using the resources that are readily available, which they not only use but sell abroad. So these are some of the key challenges. The third challenge is, if you look at the population explosion, developing countries are rapidly growing at an enormous pace. And so we know for a fact that if we were to look per capita, there will be more people, for example, in Africa by 2050 than there are in other parts of the world. This then means that the energy demand is unlikely to decline in developing countries, yet they're the ones who have the least access to energy. So this is another challenge that I think is quite peculiar to developing countries. But why are we talking about this in the context of the globe? Because we all live under the same sun. The impacts of climate change affect us all, and therefore we must deal with this challenge not just at an individual level, but at an overarching global scale.
Now I think I should capitalize on your expertise of being a lawyer. So I just want you to maybe throw some light on especially when we think of, say, a common energy policy. Because when I try to think about it, questions like there are so many countries in the world, there are so many different backgrounds to it. There's a set of unique issues, a set of problems that these individual countries face. But when you come to achieving a common ground in terms of coming up with a common energy policy, how do you tackle these individualistic problems, and how do you kind of look at these individual states and then kind of frame a common policy? And I think your PhD thesis was also on something related to a global perspective in terms of coming about towards an international energy law.
What makes it radically difficult is that we have disparate systems and we have competing interests. So as you've rightly put it, different countries have different priorities, and some of these priorities are diametrically opposed to each other. An example is coal-producing countries wish to maximize the revenues from selling coal and harnessing coal, yet the rest of the world is looking at reducing carbon emissions. The UNFCCC, which is the UN framework on climate change, has had attempts to tackle this challenge, and which culminated in the Paris Agreement in 2015. So the Paris Agreement tried to look at the climate issues and bring all countries, despite their differences, to acknowledge the existence of the climate crisis and signed an agreement to try and deal with it. However, if you have about 194, 197 odd parties that are trying to reach a compromise, you will not take the most ambitious path. You will take the path of least resistance, which then means that the scale of action needed is not going to be met by the type of forums that exist on an international scale. Secondly, we don't have a common energy law, but we see emerging energy law principles and aims. Sustainable Development Goal 7 is one good example. We have a shared aim around the world to have affordable, accessible, and clean energy for everybody. So rather than focus on having one system of law, my proposition is, and I submit this quite strongly, is we need to identify the common principles and the common goals, and then use that as the baseline for legal formulation at all levels, whether it's international, national, provincial, or local level. But it goes beyond this. So who's responsible for energy systems? If we simply look at states and governments, we will not succeed in the scale of the challenge. As I've mentioned, about 63% of carbon emissions are traceable to 90 companies. So this is not just a public problem, a public sector problem. The private sector must, one, participate in the transition, but must also be called into account for their emissions. So with that long-winded answer, I think there are various ways with which to handle that problem. There is no single panacea, and I do not see one global energy law serving us all.
Now, if you were to kind of divert towards tech, how do you think technology will solve the global climate change or maybe energy crisis?
Technology will go a long way in resolving the crisis, but technology as a standalone measure will not. We need techno-legal interventions, we need social interventions, and we need financial interventions. Having said that, technology is going to be key. For example, we've seen the price of solar panels plummet by maybe 2, 3, 400% in just the last decade, which means that solar energy is now more affordable, which means the transition from fossil fuels to solar energy is now feasible. Before, there was no price parity. Now, in some parts of the world, solar energy is more affordable than fossil fuels. So technology can actually deal with certain elements of what we call the energy crisis and address them. Secondly, there are certain technologies that are touted as having the capacity to solve the energy problem. Storage is one example. If we get good battery storage or energy storage solutions, we may not need to produce any more energy than we are now, because the energy that's being produced can then be stored and be used as and when needed. So energy storage is one area in which the energy problems can actually be resolved and accelerate the transition. The third thing is a bit of a sad thing. Technology creates problems as well as solving problems. In what we are now seeing as the technology revolution, a lot of power is needed for processing of information, hosting of data centers. Some of the largest companies in the world are tech companies that have huge carbon footprints and energy consumption. So technology itself is one of the largest consumers of energy, more than even households, or even more than certain industries. So revolutionizing and decarbonizing the tech industry will go a long way in ensuring that we make the just transition. But there are other things that I could talk about. So there's a question of cost, there's a question of how that can be resolved, but we also will go to smarter energy systems, which is now not just about how much energy we generate to serve existing populations, but having more efficient measures that then what we call demand side innovation, where the demand side is sort of manipulated or automatically used by smart systems to use the energy that is being produced. So technology can easily accelerate that. Rather than looking at ramping up production, we deal with energy efficiency through technological means. So technology, yes, is one of the key elements of this.
Yeah. Do you think the UNFCCC is useful, and how do you modify it if you get a chance?
Is the UNFCCC useful? Is one of the largest questions in modern times. I think it's the least worst alternative of what we have, because it's the only existing forum in which countries, and now increasingly the private sector, are being called into account. It's not highly effective, but it's necessary. And what would I change in the UNFCCC process? I think the first thing is to give what in law is called locus, or standing, or a seat at the table, to not only negotiate but be bound by certain international rules to private parties. This has happened in other forums like the WTO, where the private sector does come in and participate. Some call it plurilateral, the plurilateral system. So I think the quickest way is to just step away from the focus on just states, but also harness or bring in the private sector, not just as observers, but as parties with greater responsibility with this. Because in the last few years, to be fair to them, from COP26 and COP27, some of the biggest milestones in the UNFCCC process have not been the nationally defined contributions, but the announcement by private sector of their net zero targets, and not just of the companies themselves. Microsoft is an example that has promised by 2030 to be carbon neutral and start becoming carbon negative. But they've gone further than that. They've said that the entire supply chain will do the same thing. And so we see a knock-on effect on this. I think also there must be funding for developing countries to be able to make that acceleration. So there's a loss and damage fund that has been announced, but I think it shouldn't just be pledges. That money should be deployed to allow developing countries to make that transformation.
Yeah. So having such an amazing and intellectually intriguing conversation, here I would like to ask one more question, which is kind of a personal, I would say. How has it been here at Alliance University? How was the journey from Kenya to Oxford to Alliance University, teaching GLA fellows here?
Alliance University has offered us such a hospitable welcome. I think the most obvious thing, I've lived in England now longer than I want to admit, so we always talk about the weather in England. So the weather here is brilliant. I mean, Bangalore has wonderful weather. There's been a cultural immersion because we went for this cultural trip, and it's just fascinating to see, centuries upon centuries of Indian civilization and culture and temples. The food has been wonderful, but then the classes themselves have been intellectually stimulating, and the class itself has offered such wonderful perspectives. It's a shame that this is coming to an end. I might just as well be convinced to ditch my home back in England and stay
We
here.
wouldn't mind that.
So thank you very much.
With that note, we thank Dr. Ted Moya Mose for joining this conversation. Thank you, sir.